Okay, everyone, it's 1 o'clock. Let's get going. Welcome to the seventh installment of Turning Point. This is the second last installment. The experience has gone very quickly from my perspective. It's been a lot of fun to help guide our facilitators and the audience through this experience. We'll have our final installment coming up on Tuesday. The point is very much to not stop here. The point is to keep this momentum, to pull some of the hard-hitting topics out of all of the Turning Point experiences and find some innovation there, get it onto policy floors, get it into practice. I think we can do it. For those of you who have been with us the entire time, thank you very much. We appreciate you being here. We know, again, we have a really nice day outside, but we appreciate you being here for this really important discussion. For those who are just with us, what is Turning Point? Turning Point is our collective opportunity to reimagine and rediscover what New Brunswick looks like on the other side of COVID-19. And today we have a really fun one. I'm really excited for this. It's entrepreneurship. How do we build and support the next generation of growth stage companies that can export internationally from New Brunswick? To do that, we have David Campbell, Dhirendra Shukla, and Jeff White. This is going to be a lot of fun. For those who don't know me and are just tuning in, I'm Matt George. I've been your moderator for the duration of this experience. For more on our podcast network and all the things that we're doing with Turning Point and our partners, you can go to @itsmattgeorge on all social media. We are also releasing this recording at turningpointnb.ca. And as you know by now, we're releasing a podcast version of each discussion that comes after the webinar on the Growing Pains with David Campbell podcast. And you can find that on Apple, Spotify, Google, and all RSS feeds. Okay, before we get going, I need to recognize our partners, as I do each and every time. The New Brunswick Business Council, Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, Tech Impact, the New Brunswick Multicultural Council, the Chambers of Commerce in Moncton, Fredericton, and St. John, Conseil économique de Nouveau-Brunswick, Atlantic Chamber of Commerce, and our partners at the Government of New Brunswick and ACOA, as well as the Pondé Center at the University of New Brunswick. For a full list of all of our facilitators and our presenting sponsors, head to turningpointnb.ca. So my role is twofold. I'm here to guide our lead facilitators and our panelists through what I think is going to be a really engaging conversation, but it's also to be a vehicle for you. Having said that, if you're in the audience, please do use the Q&A function within Zoom. We want to spend the bulk of the webinar and the entirety of the podcast addressing your questions. If you wish to leave them by name, feel free to do so and we will address you by name. Also use the chat function in Zoom. Get to know each other, and also some of our panelists have been known to engage on the chat function as well, so you never know. We also want to try to take your pulse. We want to know what you're thinking throughout the course of this experience. We also want our panelists to reflect on what you're thinking throughout this experience. And to do that, we've set up 3 poll questions, 2 at the very top of the show, which will appear momentarily, and 1 at the very end. So please do participate in those polls so we can bring those to our panelists. Again, that's 2 at the beginning of the show and 1 coming at the end. So stick around at the very end and make sure you tell us what you're thinking. If we do have a technology interruption, of course, we're doing this live. Stay with us. The content is so good that we really don't want to lose you, and we put measures in place to not have any of those technology interruptions. So before introducing our lead facilitator, you know who this guy is, but first, I want to introduce the framework for this discussion. So our committee came up with, yes, okay, we are looking into the realities of New Brunswick, but we want to pull something useful out of that, turn it into innovation, and walk the road forward. So we've adopted what are called the 4 noble truths. And it's really 4 questions, and we frame them this way. 1, what is the pain we're feeling? 2 is, what is the cause of that pain? What can we point to that's giving us that pain? 3, how does that pain get better? And 4, how do we look confidently to the future? So what does that future state of New Brunswick look like when this is all said and done? And with that, it is the time to happily introduce our lead facilitator for this discussion. I get to introduce this guy frequently. He's not only my podcast partner in crime and co-host, but he's also the former chief economist for the New Brunswick Jobs Board and founded his own economic development consulting and research firm, Jupia Consultants, Inc., in 2008. Based in Moncton, he is one of Atlantic Canada's leading economic development consultants. He has worked with more than 80 local, provincial, and national economic development agencies, industry associations, and government departments in 6 Canadian provinces and 2 American states. David, you're probably getting tired of me saying that blurb. Welcome again as lead facilitator of Turning Point version 7. The screen is now yours.
Well, thank you, Matt. Actually, that little introduction never gets old. Well, I appreciate being back with you today to talk about and discuss with Dhirendra and Jeff this very, very important issue of entrepreneurship. We'll talk a little bit during my presentation about entrepreneurship as it relates to COVID-19 and coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we'll also talk more broadly about how we nurture an environment where exciting and ambitious entrepreneurs can grow their business and build value here in New Brunswick. So I'm just going to start my presentation here by sharing my screen. So just if you'll bear with me here. Okay, so everybody should see my screen now. If you don't,
you're good to go.
Great. So how do we build and support the next generation of growth stage companies with an export focus here in New Brunswick? So that's what we'll be talking about. I'll take maybe 15 minutes to go through some background information just to sort of set the table, and then we'll get into an exciting conversation. So first of all, how will COVID-19 impact entrepreneurship in New Brunswick? So this has been a question that's been preoccupying a lot of us, where there is considerable concern about the small business environment, particularly those that provide local services, personal services, restaurants, and so on, accommodation services here in New Brunswick. And it's really likely that many small businesses will go under. A number of groups, the Chamber of Commerce, the Independent Business Group have looked at this and are anticipating quite a bit of small businesses will go under. It's unclear here in New Brunswick if there will be enough budding entrepreneurs to step into the breach. So if there are losses in sectors like restaurants and personal services and professional services, whether or not there'll be enough entrepreneurs to take their place. There's some concern that COVID-19 might actually dampen the appetite for entrepreneurial risk. It's already hard enough to invest your capital and start a new business because of issues like competition, like market demand, like fickle customers and consumers. Now you have to deal with a pandemic, potentially an overhang from a pandemic moving forward. So that is a concern. That we will not have enough entrepreneurs. And if we don't have enough entrepreneurs, what steps into the breach? Do we see more concentration of economic activity among larger firms, among national firms or international firms? So really, we do want to have a vibrant local entrepreneurial environment and an entrepreneurial class here in the province of New Brunswick. But COVID-19 could create new entrepreneurial spaces. So again, a lot of people are thinking about that. Things like home-focused services, so taking products and services directly to people's homes. So we saw that emerging during the lockdowns, but moving forward for older residents and so on. If we think about niche products and services related to the pandemic and the post-pandemic world, technology solutions, new export opportunities. So there are specific opportunities related to COVID-19 that we need to explore here in the province. But one of the questions, the overhang questions that we'll talk about with the panel is where are these entrepreneurs going to come from in the coming years? So let me just give you a few statistics about entrepreneurship in New Brunswick before we get into the discussion. So there's actually not a lot of agreement around what is an entrepreneur. Is it a self-employed person, anybody that's self-employed, or do they have to be self-employed and actually have workers on the payroll and deployed capital? Is it somebody that has an export-oriented business? We do know that, in generally speaking, entrepreneurs have ideas. They have a market idea that they want to test in the market. They have an appetite for risk, and most of them are pretty bullheaded. So they've got an idea, they think it'll work, and they drive it into the marketplace. And that would be a pretty good, I think, definition of what an entrepreneur is. From a Statistics Canada perspective, there's basically two classes of self-employed that they track. One is anybody that's self-employed, and the second are people that are self-employed with employees. So the data I'm going to show you shows both the self-employment and self-employment with employees. So the two kinds of entrepreneurs we want here in the province are locally focused entrepreneurs to ensure we have dynamic markets for local services. You want more than one pet groomer, you want more than one pizza shop or coffee shop or legal services firm. You want a whole mix of local and national and international firms serving the markets and giving you a choice in terms of products and services. But we also want export focused entrepreneurs, because those are the individuals that are building companies that actually export into the rest of Canada, around the world, and bring money back into our province that is then turned into consumer spending and tax revenue here in the province. So this is just a few stats. This is self-employment in New Brunswick among all industries, and comparing to the national average, just to give us a sense of where we sit. And I won't go through all of these, but for all of the data moving forward, I have self-employment adjusted for size or per thousand workers. I have female self-employment compared to Canada, and youth self-employment. Those are two subcategories that we're particularly interested in when we think about business ownership or entrepreneurship. And you don't have to worry about writing down these stats. You can download this presentation or see this presentation at the turningpointnb.ca website. So across all industries, if we look at self-employment, we actually have 26% less self-employment compared to the rest of the country. And if you look at self-employment with paid help or employees, we're actually about 18% less than the national average. If you look at female self-employment, the numbers are the disparity with the rest of the country is even higher, 25% less here and 23% among those that have paid help. And then if you look at youth self-employment, which is a key indicator, we actually have a significant gap with the rest of the country. And again, this crosses all industries. Only about 44 out of every 1,000 workers are self-employed, or only about 14 out of every 1,000 are self-employed with paid help. And that's 34% below the national average. If you look at the manufacturing sector, which is a key sector, also a fairly big spread with the rest of the country. Interestingly enough, if we look at just self-employment in manufacturing, the gap for female self-employment is less than for male or certainly for youth. We don't see a lot of young manufacturing-related entrepreneurs here in the province, and I think that's a concern, and we can discuss that more in the panel. If we look at IT services, again, a big gap with the rest of the country, nearly half as many people that are self-employed and 32% less self-employment with paid help relative to the rest of the country, even though we've put a tremendous amount of effort into try and incubate and support IT-related entrepreneurs. We still have far fewer here than we have in the rest of the country. If you look at female self-employment in the IT sector, even a more stark contrast there compared to the rest of the country. Now, if we look at personal services, so that's everything from funeral services to pet grooming to hairdressing services, we actually have more self-employment than the rest of the country. So if you look at just self-employment, 20% more compared to the rest of the Canada, female self-employment, 40% more compared to the rest of the country, and youth self-employment, 43% more. So on just the self-employment side, that's self-employment without employees, well above average and actually slightly below average when we look at personal services firms that actually have paid workers. If you look at ambulatory healthcare services, so these would be your dentists and your eye doctors and any physiotherapists, any incorporated firms in the healthcare service space, slightly below the national average for self-employment, but actually above the national average for self-employment with paid help. So I think what we're seeing here is that if you're locally focused on healthcare or focused on personal services, our self-employment rates are pretty good. It's those industries that are more export focused where we have considerably less self-employment compared to the rest of the country. So just a couple of more slides here to talk about this. This is from the Labor Force Survey, which is published every month. If you look at the annual trend in self-employment, and this is self-employment with employees and without employees, it peaked way back in 1996. We had nearly 46,000 people that year that were self-employed, and it's been slipping sort of slowly since. We're down to about 38,900 people that are self-employed, and as you'll see in a moment, they are predominantly skewed toward an older demographic. If you look at self-employment with paid help, again, the same trend. Back around 1996, we maxed out at just under 19,000 people that were self-employed but also had employees, and that's been dipping since, and we're down to under 15,000 now in 2019 that were self-employed with paid help. So comparing to the rest of the country, it's always good to compare yourself to the rest of the country. The numbers aren't great. If you look at New Brunswick, if you set Canada as an index 1.00, and then you vary the provinces based on the intensity of self-employment with paid help, we're actually 15% below the national average, and that compared to all other provinces, only Newfoundland and Labrador has a lower self-employment index than we do, and you can see here in the chart how that's changed over time. So female, as I said before, we want to understand the dynamic, and actually if you just look at self-employment, this isn't self-employment with employees, but if you look at self-employment, New Brunswick actually has a higher share of females self-employment. So about 40% of all people that claim to be self-employed are females. That's above the national average of 37%. So again, a lot of that is in the personal services and healthcare space, and not necessarily with employees, but certainly it's a good trend to see that we're seeing an increase in the number of females active in self-employment. So this is another challenge. This comes off the 2016 census, so it's already 4 years old. But back in 2016, 42% of everybody that was self-employed was over the age of 55. So that's 2 out of every 5 people that are self-employed heading toward retirement in the next 10 years. If you look at other sectors, accommodation and food, transportation and warehousing, manufacturing, and so on, the ratios are even higher. So the issue is, do we have enough younger people with the motivation to be self-employed or the entrepreneurial chops or interest to take their place as these folks exit the workforce and look for somebody to come in and succeed them in their business? So where do entrepreneurs come from? Just a couple more slides and then we'll turn it over to the group. Well, there's lots of data on this. Entrepreneurs come from exiting of big firms. So maybe they're disgruntled or frustrated and they have a big idea. If you look here in New Brunswick, a lot of our tech entrepreneurs actually got their start or were associated with NBTel, the telephone company, from a few years ago. After that, that firm was merged into Bell, a lot of these entrepreneurs spun out of that and created very impressive firms here in the province. Universities and colleges developing intellectual property tend to be another source where entrepreneurs are incubated. Actually, the children of entrepreneurs tend to be far more likely to be entrepreneurs themselves than the children of non-entrepreneurs, which is an interesting dynamic as well. Immigrants tend to have a higher entrepreneurship rate or self-employment rate than non-immigrants. And then there's the proverbial garage. So who's actually starting companies in their garage? I don't think that's as big a deal as people think it is, but there are some people that just have a great idea and they just make it work and they get out there and start their business. So are we exporting our potential entrepreneurs? Another challenging question for us. A few years ago, Dr. Michael Hahn looked at people that were born in New Brunswick and still living in New Brunswick, and he compared that to people who were born in New Brunswick but left and were living elsewhere in Canada. And he determined that those that have left are twice as likely to own a business or to be self-employed with employees than those that stayed here. So the question for us is, are we actually exporting our potential entrepreneurs, or are the destinations they're going to more conducive to entrepreneurship? So I think that's an interesting sort of open-ended question about the risk profile of our citizens and their desire to take entrepreneurial risk versus finding a job in a more stable sort of employment setting. So fostering a new generation of ambitious entrepreneurs, just one more slide here. So how do we do it? Well, I think we have to attract entrepreneurs to our shores. We can't just wait for them to show up. I think we have to be more proactive. Big firms should foster more intramural entrepreneurial activity. We've got a lot of global world-class firms here. And within those firms, there should be budding entrepreneurs that see opportunities for entrepreneurship, immigrants, local succession planning and export-oriented business ideas. We have a number of small startup incubators and accelerators around the province. We have to think about, are they achieving what we want them to achieve? Are we seeing these high growth potential entrepreneurs coming out of these incubators and accelerators. And a perennial challenge is around the access to risk capital. If you need $50,000, lots of providers of that in New Brunswick. If you need 5 million, not much. So that's, I'm sure, something that will come up in the panel discussion. So we also want to talk about scale up, and I won't spend time on this slide because I'm sure the panel discussion will discuss that. But certainly how we can get the small firms to scale up is incredibly important. And with that, I will turn it back, Matt, to you to talk about our two guest speakers.
David, thank you so much. There's so many things that I want to talk about in regards to COVID-19. I think our appetite for risk is a really good place to start. I know Jeff and Narendra both are going to have really good thoughts on that. So we'll crack right into it. Our first panelist is Jeff White of the New Brunswick Innovation Fund. Jeff White is the lead visionary at the New Brunswick Innovation Foundation. He's a technology industry veteran and a seasoned corporate financing expert. I hear he's a bit of a basketball player too. He's worked with some of our region's biggest startups, Radian 6, Q1 Labs, and Genesis Laboratories Canada, and was co-founder and chief operating officer of East Valley Ventures. That experience gives Jeff a unique perspective to see and understand their growth potential in New Brunswick startup and research innovation sectors. Jeff, I know you have some really good things to say on this topic. We're excited to hear your opening remarks and some quick reflection on what you've heard from David before we get into discussion. So we're lucky to have you. The screen is now yours.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, David. Thanks, everyone, for joining in. I've got a few minutes here. I'll just try and frame up a little bit around what David presented, maybe build on a little bit, and then we can throw it open for Q&A. So at NBIF, anyways, we are spending most of our time at the very beginning part of a journey for someone who's looking to be a budding entrepreneur, primarily in the intellectual property field. They don't have hard assets. They have ideas. They have parts of a team, and they need some capital. That industry, if you think about it, and I'll use when NBIF was formed as the start, but it goes back even further. But when it became formal, is about 16 years ago that the government created NBIF and started putting some risk capital into applied research and into new commercial entities. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the commercial entities. So on that journey to get to a scaling company, whether startup or scale up, and I think these three, there's almost like an order of operations has been my experience. And this is the three that I kind of think about. And they go in this sequential order. There's capital, right, which is cash, funding, venture, equity. I'll talk a little bit about that. That leads to talent. That leads to customers. Customers being the source of when you start to see revenue of scale and revenue that can sustain the business. Absent one or either of those, one or many of those, you'll have a hard time scaling export-oriented technology companies from our region. When it comes to capital, NBIF plays in the area that's probably the riskiest and most sensitive part of the journey for a company. That's the very beginning. The risk appetite for most people and most organizations at that stage of development is 0 to none. We step in with process, procedure, experience to try and fund an entrepreneur through that part of the journey. And what's important to think about is if you need capital, will then allow you to attract and retain talent. And then talent will help you develop your product and ultimately lead to customers. One of the things that has happened over the last 15 years, and COVID-19 is highlighting, is this a good or a bad thing, or should it continue, is in order to get to scale-ups, we need startups. We need that experimentation. We need the base of the pyramid to be supported. Right now, COVID-19, the focus is on which ones are being selected. I'll use that word for further support. And the trade-off is, and the dichotomy that we're all struggling with, and NBIF included, and other funding venture capital firms across the country, you can't just leave one to go chase the other one, because we built up a pretty good base to create some of those success stories that were referenced in the past. So that's one of the challenges. So we are balancing that act to say there are companies in the scaling stage on their way with customers reaching up that are going to need capital that otherwise they would not have needed. And at the same time, we can't lose track of the fact that necessity is a great time when great companies are created. And I expect, and my past experience would say, there will be some really unique and global opportunities that are going to pop up here over the next 12 to 15 months because of necessity will come from areas. If I come back to talent, there's the startup talent and then there's a scale-up talent. The sources of those talent that we look at are universities. We saw mentioned earlier, we will see people pop out of organizations. That has happened. If you go back to 2003, 2010, we saw things happen where there's a correction in the market. Companies actually shed staff, and that staff then goes and creates new companies. And then the accelerators and incubators around the region are critical to that. And in NBIF's world, we're heavily involved with the universities and two key accelerators in the region. Propel being, I'm the chair of that, I'll declare that. It's a regional IT accelerator focusing on helping companies get to revenue. And then we work closely with UMB at Energia in terms of the staff and sector-specific companies they're developing. So much so that we actually look to graduates of that and make investments in those companies. We look to those two parts of the funnel as key areas to look for startup companies. And then the third, and we'll come back around and show, is our customers. What's important about customers, scaling companies have to look globally for those opportunities. And most of the companies we do, I'll give you a couple: SmartScan, IntroHive, Eigen, Cognitive Spark. Those are some names you'll see are on our website, and there's others. But here's a part that's been a struggle. Local customers. Local customers have been a little slower in the uptake and adopting the technologies that these companies have been using in terms of implementing and using either to develop the product, or actually once those are product and burned in globally, buying those. And second, there's revenue pressure from a local perspective when it comes to buying products or services. One of the themes that are happening now is we're seeing cost creep into growing a global company. Talent costs are going up because the introduction of global companies into the region. And there's a theme now that these large global companies have opened up to say you don't need to work in San Francisco, Toronto, Montreal. They are willing to hire anywhere. So we're going to see that come up. We need to think about the impact that on our local customer base in terms of acquiring products and services. So the three things I just wanted to talk about, and we can come back to them, will be the capital, the talent, and the customers. And all three of those are, I would call, order of operations and critical to looking at growing export-oriented technology companies in our region. Thanks, Matt.
Jeff, thank you very much. Lots to unpack there, and we'll do so in the Q&A and the discussion. Our final panelist, Dr. Dhirendra Shukla of the University of New Brunswick. Dhirendra is professor and the Dr. J. Herbert Smith Akoa Chair in Technology Management and Entrepreneurship at the University of New Brunswick. Dhirendra utilizes his expertise from the telecom sector and extensive academic background in the areas of entrepreneurial finance, Masters of Business Administration and Engineering to promote a bright future for New Brunswick. Passionate about entrepreneurship, design, engineering, innovation, and leadership, Dhirendra ignites the same passion in others through his teaching at UNB, local entrepreneurial community outreach, and the creation of programs such as the Masters of Technology Management and Entrepreneurship Program, Technology Commercialization Program, the Summer Institute, and Energia Ventures. Dr. Shukla, I also invite you to give your opening remarks and some brief reflection on what we've heard from Jeff and Dave, and then we'll have everyone come back for discussion and Q&A. The screen is now yours.
Thank you very much, Matt. And I'm very humbled to be invited to be speaking as a panelist. You know, a lot of the things that David touched on and Jeff talked about, I came to New Brunswick after the collapse of Nortel Networks. My division was bought out. And I came to New Brunswick not really sure about what to expect. But before that, as a child, I came to Canada when I was 12 years old, and I fell in love with Canada. And so when I graduated from my undergrad and grad school in the UK, I wanted to find a way on how I can come to Canada and work here. And I was very fortunate to start working at Nortel. So after the collapse of Nortel, I was searching for a place that gave me meaning. A place for the heartache and pain that I had gone through at Nortel. I really wanted a break. And So I came to UNB, and I have to be honest, the environment at the university, the environment in New Brunswick was such that it allowed me to be myself, allowed me to flourish. It is not easy to be a visible minority in all those contexts. But I have to be honest that the environment was such that I had a lot of opportunity, and the university created those amazing opportunities for me. And when I started at the program, I hadn't taught a class in my life. The center, the center has been around since 1988. At that time, I went to the president, Dr. Eddie Campbell, and I said, Eddie, we have no students, and we really at the center have no money. What are we going to do? He said, welcome to the world of entrepreneurship. Welcome, and now it's your opportunity to figure that out. So starting that journey, I said, as an entrepreneur, what would we do? And we started reconfiguring our program that had been around since 1988. In a 20-year history, we had launched one startup. And we had about 12 to 20 students in the program. And I said, well, we really don't have much to lose. Let's really go dig deep. And what's the worst someone can say? The worst someone can say is call me up and I said, it was that other Dhirendra Shukla that we had offered. I don't know where you showed up from. So I said, I've got nothing to lose. Let's try it out. Let's experiment. Let's have fun. And as a result, we stand here since 2009. We stand here today. Our student numbers have gone from, at that time was about 24 students a year. Right now, we're working with over 633 students. In our last 5 years, we've launched over 39 startups. And we have all been able to do that because we've been working with amazing partners. When we talk about amazing partners, we're talking about we're working with the federal government. We're talking about we're working with the provincial government. We're working very closely with NBIF because if you know, Jeff brought up Energy Ventures. That is part of one of the incubators and accelerator programs that we offer. So we created an opportunity within the university for young people to experiment. And we found a little bit of money with our partners. Then we presented this idea of what we were doing to RBC. RBC bought in, and we created a small fund for students to work with and prototype and experiment. And that became an amazing experience for students to go do interesting things. Then we partnered with a family that came from Toronto that came and said, we are interested in seeing what you're doing with the students. And they spoke to some of our students and they were simply overwhelmed and said, how can we get involved and help? So what they created was a fund for our students to travel anywhere in the world. And the students would travel and live, and all funded by this family in Toronto. So what I'm trying to say is that we started off, and as we experimented, as we did certain things, so many people aligned, so many people came on board and wanted to be part of this amazing journey. And then we started partnering with some of the top accelerators around the world. Techstars had launched a global accelerator network. And we started to focus on building an incubator and accelerator programs that was a blend. So we launched the Summer Institute that is focused on the creative economy. And David Campbell talked about Michael Hahn. Michael Hahn, as he will note that Michael Hahn is also no longer in New Brunswick. But at that time, I was teaching this course, Managing in the Creative Economy, with an amazing human being and a great friend called Rob Austin. And we were looking at creative people and creative businesses. And as a result of that teaching with Rob Austin, I created and launched the Summer Institute. And the Summer Institute funds and supports the creative class. And from there, we launched Energia Ventures. We started the Masters in Technology Management Entrepreneurship program. We partnered with MIT on developing a mentorship program. And then we partnered with George Washington University in IP commercialization, out from the lab to the market. Lots of exciting things are taking place. A lot of amazing things that are happening. But the question is, how are we putting policies and things in place to support the young people that want to experiment, to support new immigrants, to support women in business, to support visible minorities how do we support, how do we put those processes in place? And we have the ability to do that. And how do we have a trajectory that is a 3-year, 5-year, 15-year, 25-year trajectory, that we begin to think of the long game rather than our past or our present? How do we begin to work in a unique way to paint a brighter and exciting future? Because our young people are looking for that. Young people are waiting and desperately hungry to say, okay, we understand the current crisis. What are you doing to help us? What are you doing to support us? And we need to define that. We need to be able to help and support them. And we can only do that together, because we as a community are very affectionate and loving, are interconnected. If there was any place that can do that, it's New Brunswick. And I consider New Brunswick to be Newton's apple orchard. Primarily, it is one amazing place where, similar to how Newton connected dots by that apple falling and connected and created magic and became an amazing human being that set the trajectory for physics, we have the same opportunity here in New Brunswick and Atlantic Canada. We have a beautiful place with amazing people that are gifted and hardworking with no egos. And we can just lift the whole region together and make magic happen if there's a will, need, and a want. And I'm confident we can come out the other end very strong. And I say that as a person that comes from a visible minority, that was born in India, grew up in Zambia, educated in the UK, and moved to Canada for my career. We have everything, all the ingredients to be a magical place. We just need to come together and do it and believe in ourselves.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shukla. I totally agree with that, but we're going to get into why we have some of these discrepancies. And we're going to bring back our lead facilitator and our panelists. But Dhirendra, we'll stay with you for 1 minute. If you could leave your screen on and stay with us. We want to address the elephant in the room here in COVID-19. And I know that it has presented some opportunities, but it also has presented some challenges as well. Dhirendra, I'm wondering, when we come out of this thing, is there going to be a lower appetite for risk? Will people gravitate towards steady employment instead of entrepreneurship? And one of the reasons I ask, Richard Saillant, one of our other lead facilitators for these sessions, has said that the size of our public sector in relation to the size of the private sector has actually been a COVID-19 buffer. But we do need to keep investing in the private sector and ensure that it grows. Will the public sector and steady jobs with steady salary and a pension keep growing because of the fear economically of what has happened? The question being, is there an entrepreneurial winter coming, or will we encourage people to start our next best companies in the face of COVID-19?
Well, you're asking a person that always looks at a glass half full, right? So you're asking, I always look at any crisis and say, how do we make the most of the situation? How do we navigate this delicately and really come out stronger? So when you have a crisis, So if you look at if you look at post World War II, the infrastructure buildup that took place built Canada as a nation. Most of the developed economies developed that infrastructure that was needed was post World War II. So after tragedy, after a lot of heartache and pain, people coming together and gelling to come out stronger at the other end. But there was a need, there was a want, and there was a requirement for our community to come together and put those infrastructure needs and wants out there and create that opportunity for everyone to come on board. So right now, for example, I'm working with 8 brand new young student-based startups, over 100 100 startups from around the world that have applied to the Summer Institute, and over 100 that have applied to Energia. People from around the world that want to be part of this community, part of this excitement and energy. No matter what happens, the entrepreneurs are people that want to take on risk, want to understand that, but how do we create an opportunity? They're not crazy people. They just want an infrastructure and a way, how do they mitigate risk? So young people are asking me, my students, the ones that are running those 8 to 10 startups are asking, what are we going to do about my student loan? What are we going to do as a new immigrant? If you heard about, so if you look at some of the startups that Jeff talked about, the immigrant entrepreneurs that are leading companies like SmartSkin, Resin, Simtech, so you look at it and say, okay, so if that is happening, from them as visible minorities, immigrants, how hard and challenging it was for them to start their venture, launch their venture, and become successful to a point right now where we all are celebrating and talking about them. Mm-hmm. So how do we put the processes in place? Because those opportunities where people would turn around and say to me, there was about 6-8 years back where people will tell me that did not want their kids and children to stay in New Brunswick. They wanted them out. Guess what? There is no out. They're here, right? So if they're here, how do we look at this and say, we're not saying COVID is good, but this is a great opportunity for us to totally grab onto, focus on how do we retain and keep young people here, give them the opportunity, build entrepreneurial culture. We have the strength, we have the ability, we have the community. How do we suddenly pull it all together and say, let's create a program, let's create an opportunity for all the young people to stay, if possible, bring more people here, if possible, find a way to accelerate young immigrants and students that are already here to launch their businesses and do amazing things. Jeff alluded to a possibility of working with government as a place for experimentation, large companies and corporations being a test bed. We haven't tapped all those vehicles to really become a machine and do phenomenal things. This is the right time to do all of that, all of it.
Thanks, Dhirendra. We're going to come to you, Jeff, with a very similar question. Still highlighting the effects of COVID-19. I know you recently wrote a piece called Phase 2, Returning to the New Normal, but I'm interested in those 3 pillars that you mentioned. 1 is capital, 2 is talent, 3 is customers. Kind of a 2-parter here. Which one of those has been exposed negatively by COVID-19, and which one is there maybe now a new door open? You don't have to stay on that question as hard and fast as I've asked it, but is there an opportunity within those 3 somewhere given COVID-19, or is there one that it has negatively impacted more than the rest?
Well, I'd say for the scaling companies, just to stay with it, because of the 3, they were on a pathway where customers were close by. They had revenues, they have what they call backlog orders, products that were ready to go. So some of our customers some of our companies who were great companies on a great trajectory went off a cliff. Industry shut down on them overnight. So, and in that case, totally outside control. Is it the industry gone away? No. Has it deferred? Yes. So what does that do? That takes a company that wasn't looking for capital because it was on the revenue stream and brings it back in and say, listen, to get across We went through this 4 years ago, the company might have said, where there was a 2-year, we were 12 months away from revenue. They're on a revenue cycle, they're scaling, they're growing. So they built a business around a model of continued revenue. They go off the cliff, we need to step in, and we, being MBF, step in where we weren't planning to step in because we didn't think we needed to get them back to that mark when that market comes back. So that's one example. We have another one. So that's the harsh reality of a company that was scaling. We have another one that was back at the startup stage that had to leapfrog ahead and say demand went up exceptionally high. So they're in a position where they're running into supply issues around some of they're an app, or not an app, but their platform runs on other hardware. The hardware is under huge demand. They're providing the ability to do remote maintenance with less people, huge demand. So so now they have another need for capital and talent. They're scrambling for talent because they were on a plan that was going one way. So those two things, it's all interconnected. Capital seems to be a common, because either, we bridge the company that's struggling, or not struggling, but has a gap, or we've got to go fund this growth. And what's happened in the traditional capital markets, investors who would have expected to show up have kind of retrenched a bit because they're repurposing on their portfolio in the venture world. Said, hang on, some of my companies, just like I explained in MBIF's world, are coming back when they weren't expected to come back. They're great companies, they have great opportunities. It's a timing issue. And then the reverse is happening as well. Then that highlights talent, So now we're thinking about where do you get the talent? And now with this move to, you don't need to be working in the same office. And, I don't know how many days we're into this, and I've read, and maybe people know, after 21 or 30 days, a habit is formed or broken. You go back to some. So we're seeing companies getting more comfortable at operating remote. More importantly, we're seeing customers get more comfortable dealing with companies remote. The big question mark that we're all wondering on that remoteness is, can companies purchase remote? So are they willing to purchase in this remote world, make significant investments that otherwise, the typical process, you had this, we had to look across the table at each other. Looking across our laptop wasn't good enough. I mean, this technology we're using today was around a year ago. It's been around for 10 years. So are we going to see habits and processes adapt to allow this to happen, to let revenue flow again?
Right. And we can unpack that during the podcast as well.
Yeah.
David, I want to come to you. I love this idea that Dhirendra issued. It's kind of a cultural issue, this optimism around creating companies, being the tinkerer in the garage. You mentioned the garage. It's interesting because, some of the biggest companies in the world were created there, but it really, to me, is more symbolic of that, exactly what Dhirendra said, giving the opportunity to tinker, giving the opportunity to explore, and incubating those next entrepreneurs. I've made this comment about my parents' generation, and I want to highlight that date of 1996. There almost seems to be this kind of post-industrial PTSD where you have to go to a job at one of our big HQs right out of university because that's safe and that works. It's certainly what I was taught. And until I was able to hawk my wares and services on public markets and received money for it, I didn't even know you could be an entrepreneur. And that was in my early 20s. What is this 1996 date? Do we know why we started to lose our entrepreneurial drive at that date? Because usually when you see a graph, you see the early 2000s or 2008 or now 2020. Do we have any knowledge around why then we started to, because we were gaining consistently based on that graph?
Yeah, I mean, Dhirendra Shukla is what happens when you put a disruptive entrepreneur inside a university. So we're still seeing that play out. We'll see where it ends up. It's an interesting experiment in the culture of a university. I don't know what's going on with 1996. I think you had a period of solid growth across the province. You had entrepreneurial opportunities opening up in a variety of industries. You had the population that was tremendously younger. Right, the median age in 1996 would have been somewhere around 29, 30. I think as we get older, we're less likely to take risk. I think some older New Brunswickers might dabble in entrepreneurship as a sideline after they start their pension. So I think it was really, again, we say so much of this comes back to demographics, but I think part of it was demographics. We had a lot of young people, and there was opportunities emerging for, again, 85% of all entrepreneurs are serving local markets. It's actually 90%. Very relatively few actually export. So most of those entrepreneurs are serving local markets, and local markets were expanding through the 90s. And then I just think, you just hit this kind of demographic wall where people are aging. There might be slightly less opportunity. We know from around 2008, the economy flatlined, and that's why you started to see some of the decline. So I think it's a demographic story, and it's also a story of optimism. That your comment about whether it's parents sort of encouraging kids to get into stable government or large firm jobs is very, very interesting. I'm not 100% sure that people that have entrepreneurial chops, the entrepreneurs that I've known, they don't necessarily do well in formal work environments anyway, right? They're restless. They don't, they don't like bosses and so on. So if you try to profile what an entrepreneur is, they don't necessarily work well in those structured environments anyway.
Yeah, no point taken. I want to introduce the results of the poll, guys. And we're going to come up to Dhirendra because it's an interesting answer. So question number 1 on the audience poll was, if you think about the successful entrepreneurs in our province who have moved on to be business leaders elsewhere, it confirms that it doesn't matter where you're from, so long as we have strong universities to nurture and develop. And 58% of our audience chose that answer. And we thank Herb Emery, our question master. What's the role of universities in entrepreneurship, Dhirendra?
If you look at the role of universities, primarily if you look at the formation of the Silicon Valley, the role if I would really encourage people to look at the secret history of the formation of Silicon Valley, how it was formed. So the way it was formed was the role of engineering and computing in the formation of the whole movement. So it's critical that businesses and all that are entrepreneurs really begin to connect with students and entrepreneurs within the tech-based students, begin to connect with engineering and computer science and facilitate entrepreneurship, product building. And if you look at whether you talk about Q1, Radian 6, iMagic TV, all those elements deeply rooted in technology-based companies. And even if you look at McCain Foods, or you look at Ganon, or look at Irving Group of companies, if you ask them, are you this or that, they're all leading through technology. So the role of universities is, how do we become the best place on the planet where we attract the right type of people from a faculty perspective, from a student perspective, from a research perspective, and address really exciting problems from an entrepreneurial perspective, from a large company perspective, and create that culture that is moving and happening and exciting, and you just become the place where people want to be. And that's what happened to the history of Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. We have a large defense military base right here. We don't engage. We need to engage not only with large businesses, but with the military, with the government, with students, with research. How do we build that all out together? And we are positioned in such an exciting place that no one's looking at. And I think universities really are the place. So if you look at, I launched a company called Grey Wolf that focuses primarily on anti-money laundering, to trace and track people that are doing money laundering. Mm-hmm. It was formed because a group of students came to me and said, these are some of the smartest kids at UNB came to me and they said, we are bored. We're going to quit university. Is there something that you can give us? Mm-hmm. And guess what? I said, guess what? We will launch this company together. We'll be shareholders. You work and lead it, and it's yours. And we formed this company. So that ability to experiment and give young people opportunity, give them an opportunity to do something meaningful, tangible, that not only is emotionally rewarding because you are now focusing on money laundering and human trafficking, but it's also intellectually rewarding. That's the right places the university to do. And I'm blessed to be working with some of the smartest people that I've surrounded myself, smartest students, and business leaders that love and care for our region and our community.
David, let's get you in here.
Well, I mean, it's fascinating because, of course, if you did this nationally, those numbers would be flipped. So if you look at Edward Glazer, if you look at Richard Florida, they say it's all about the large, sophisticated, modern cities creating this stew that creates entrepreneurial talent. We've flipped that. We say it's all about having a good university. So that I agree, universities are important, but I find we've talked about this before. A lot of the answers to these questions are really tied to who's listening and who's viewing our podcast. But I think the national consensus would be it's more about these urban environments where people are smashing together. And again, in a COVID-19 context, that's not a good metaphor. But I do think that we don't have those large cities. We don't have those sophisticated modern cities, which is why Herb Emery likes to challenge us. I think we have small, very interesting cities, but we certainly don't have Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver. So that's why we've seen, I think, this flip. The rural thing is very interesting. The fact that 36% talk about rural areas and small towns. They actually do create a lot of entrepreneurs, particularly around local services, right? So there's a need in my town for service X or Y, and I jump in. A little more concerned about export-focused entrepreneurs.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Only 7% alluded to the urban centers. The second poll, the best way to nurture and develop entrepreneurs is, we had a 63% majority here. And the best way to nurture and develop entrepreneurs is to have a business culture where successful entrepreneurs mentor and support the next generation of entrepreneurs. Jeff, do you want to have a quick word on that? What's the role of folks in the business community offering mentorship, whether it's in accelerators or incubators or otherwise?
Oh, I think it's massive. I think that's understated. That could be 100. And David, I want to take, you alluded to NBTEL, that mythical thing. And we talked about 96 as a tipping point. I moved to New Brunswick in 96 to work for that organization. You traced the lineage, and we didn't know it at the time. We were too young and naive. We were given, given rope, but given authority, given responsibility and opportunity, which now we call mentorship. Let's call it today. To do things like iMagic TV and fail miserably and learn on the processes of the genesis and the iMagic TVs. And then you take that company, which went public and blew up. 80% of the executive team at Radiant 6 is the same team, except we're 10 years. I'm going to use wiser. I don't know if it's smarter, but wiser. So the amount of mentorship and what mentorship provides you is, like I said, opportunity, authority, but it gives you the chance, do not be fearful of failure. Fail fast, fail forward, fail all those things. But you need to have that in the culture, that this is an experimentation. And mentorship, again, that's a word that showed up in the second half of my career, not at the beginning, but as I look back, it was you called your family's friend to say, look, I got an idea about my job. I'm going to a university. You walked down the hall and went in the corner office to find out what was going on, or someone pulled you out and said, I'm going to take you to lunch, or I'm going to take you into some situation you really aren't ready for, but you need to start doing it. So we have to have that embedded in the into an innovation ecosystem in my mind. And it has to be an obligation and a thought.
And I want to bring that discussion over to the podcast because the NBTEL story seems to be incredibly undersold to me until it was told to me by the alumni who have gone on to do these amazing things.
I'm one of them.
That's an unbelievable story. That's a world leader. And so I'm excited to look at that as well. And then the second answer, very quickly, 27% of folks said by making entrepreneurship part of not only K-12, but post-secondary education curriculum and programming. And I can see you nodding along, Durendra. I think it's important that we do that. David, I want to give you the quick final word here as we go into the podcast about those poll results.
So we have something around 400 government employees that are involved in economic development. If you take ONB, all the locals, and a CO, and you roll everybody up, it's around 400. and apparently only one of them is actually listening or watching today, because we only got one answer talking about the importance of public sector experts. But we have to understand that government plays a huge role. They invest a lot of money either in their direct employment at places like ONB, but also supporting organizations like NBIF and a number of Durendra's ventures. So we can't ignore the role of government, not only in this province, but across the country.
David Campbell, Durendra Shukla, Jeff White, thank you so much for comprising the 7th installment of Turning Point. We're going to head over to the podcast now. That will be available on the Growing Pains with David Campbell podcast feed tomorrow morning. Next week on Tuesday, we're back for the final installment of Turning Point. Thank you so much for being with us. We do encourage you to register for that session individually. And please, before you leave, do answer that last poll. We'll bring that over and we'll get Durendra, Jeff, and David's responses to the final poll. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for your questions. You will have them answered by name. We'll see you on Tuesday.